Siskel and Ebert argue about Batman, plus a rundown of many other TV critics and a possible sneak preview of the best facial hair category in the Season 10 baddies. Battle of the Network shows. Join Rick Brooks and Mike Kogel as they explore the TV of the 70s and 80s through hand-picked episodes of their favorite and not-so-favorite series.
Welcome to Battle of the Network shows. I'm Mike from the Chicago Sun-Times.
And I'm Rick from the Chicago Tribune.
And we actually have no affiliation with those newspapers. I don't even know if they exist anymore. Is it the Chicago Trunk now? But we're going to be talking about Siskel and Ebert. I don't. At this point, the episode we're doing, the show was pretty much just called Siskel and Ebert, right?
Yes, it went through several forms, several titles, and different networks and platforms over the years, but basically I think it's easy just to call it Siskel and Ebert. I think if you go to the Wikipedia page, it's just Siskel and Ebert.
Yeah, the granddaddy and certainly the best of the movie review shows, and the show that created at least on TV, the two critics talking about movies format. So I guess in a way we have them to thank for this show a little bit too.
Yeah, you could be right with that. Yes.
Unlike Siskel and Ebert, who seemed to dislike each other on air but liked each other in person, we seem to like each other on air and despise each other in person. Right?
That's exactly right. Yes, we flipped the script on that one.
Yeah. No.
To good results, I think. But
yeah, that's not true.
No.
Yeah. So I mean, where should we start with this?
Well, if I may, let me call back to a previous episode we did, Mike, when we did our catching up episode as kind of a little sneak preview, as it were, of this 10th season. I think I mentioned some things I've been watching as sort of comfort food, and I don't think I mentioned this one, though, but one of the shows that I was watching kind of, when wife of the show, Lori, was in the hospital, and I was, kind of in nearby with her, but one of the shows that I kind of would watch to take my mind off things, and we're all doing fine now, of course, is the Siskel and Ebert shows, like some of the very early ones. And I started just kind of watching them out of curiosity and knowing that we were going to talk about them this season. And then I really got into it, and it became a very comforting thing for me, even though we have the vision and the image of them as being these, contentious film critics arguing all the time. There was something kind of relaxing about just two guys talking about movies in a theater, in a theater set or whatever. I really enjoyed it, and I really got hooked on watching these, and I've really enjoyed watching them for the podcast. And I'm going to keep watching them because I didn't realize how many old episodes were available online, and I'm loving that they're all there.
Well, I want to thank you for coming up with this idea, because I've been really in the last week or two in preparation for this watching a bunch and having the similar reaction, I think, and the reaction I had also to talk about Mr. Rogers and some other things we're having coming up with it, which is just really enjoying watching things, like getting a good feeling of joy. And in some cases, like this episode, I'm like 99% sure I saw when it aired.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Just given some of the movies in it and the time period. So there's a nostalgia thing, but it's also, they're so good at it. And they have interesting things to say, and it's also like an interesting time capsule when you think about really how much time they were on the air together before Gene Siskel passed away. They really covered a lot of changes in the movie world. To watch their first episode and see them talking about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest,
right? And
then in this one they're talking about like Batman. That seems like a long way apart. Although I guess Jaws had already been out, but things had. The shift from the wild late 60s and early 70s to the sort of blockbuster thing was just starting to happen. And, of course, that's too... We've talked about perceptions of age and stuff is like... I mean, when they started the show, they were, in their late 20s or early 30s? And Siskel was only 50-something when he passed away. So they're really... Even though they're critics, so they're sort of authority figures, they're young guys. That's cool to see. I don't know about Gene Siskel's mustache. in that first episode, but
Right.
or their clothes.
Yeah, and you also see some of the changes in television. The show itself has remained two guys in a similar set talking about movies, showing clips, which doesn't sound all that much, but it's fascinating to watch now. But the history of their show takes you through like the early days at public broadcasting into a big syndication deal with Tribune Media, and then kind of at a time when syndication was changing, they got another big deal with Disney and continued on there until Siskel died, and then Ebert continued the show with other critics. But you sort of see like changes in the industry, and as you said, it's really cool to see the changes in the movie industry. Like you go back and watch something like the reviews of Star Wars, and they're talking about. I think Gene is the one that says something like, "I hope that they don't totally abandon movies for adults," even though he likes Star Wars. And then in this episode, they talk about, they bemoan the trend towards sequels, and this is in 1989. And in some of like their early episodes, early in the 80s, they're already like worrying and complaining about, sequels. And it's like, wow, you almost want to, know what would they be saying today about, the way the movie industry is now. But to me, it's enough to just see what they said about the movie industry in the 70s and 80s, which I focused on for the podcast here. But I was personally watching like a ton of movies like in the late 90s, the early to late 90s, in the mid 90s, kind of around the time of like Pulp Fiction. And I'm going to start watching those because that's the time when I wasn't necessarily watching the show as much. It was a little bit harder to find, maybe being in syndication, and without DVRs and, they weren't showing up on Hulu or something every day. It was a little bit harder for me to watch it at that time. But I was watching all the movies. So I really like it, even though, whether you've seen the movies or not, but a lot of these movies, it's like, oh man, even in a given episode, you can just pick one at random, and you might not be interested in all of them, but maybe one or two of them you've seen and you've heard of the other ones, and even the ones you haven't heard of, they have interesting conversation about them. So it's a show that works on many levels, even, years later now.
And then, of course, the X factor is them together. Whatever it is that they had between their professional rivalry, I think maybe just their energy, like being from, the Midwest. There's just something unique about them. I mean, you look at it, you think, they're movie critics. They might be kind of, eggheads. And,
Yeah.
and they are smart guys, but I don't think they come across that way. Whereas maybe some of the other critics who replace them on versions of their shows do a little bit.
Yeah, I remember when PBS continued the show after Siskel and Ebert left, they had first Neil Gabler and Jeffrey Lyons, and then Jeffrey Lyons and Michael Medved continuing the sneak previews line. I think it was my dad that kind of he pointed out like how they came off as like more like stuffed shirts or something like that. And, maybe it wasn't even their fault, but they just didn't have the chemistry of those two. And I think them and others that have tried this format, I think one thing that distinguishes Siskel and Ebert is they were both newspaper men at heart, is how they started. And Ebert, I guess won a Pulitzer Prize, right? And they were both writers, but they were able to write or at least compose their thoughts, even in this conversation, in a way that resonated on television. Whereas I think watching some of their successors or their imitators, sometimes it seems more like they wrote it ahead of time, and it doesn't seem as natural, like they're talking to the viewers.
Right. Yeah. Even though Siskel and Ebert wrote portions of their show, it doesn't feel written, or it doesn't feel, I guess, stiff.
Yeah, and even though they're addressing each other, they're talking to each other, but they're able to do this in a way that feels like they're talking to us and engaging us as well. And yeah, like you said, the show was parts were pre-written. And one thing that amazes me, Mike, is reading, as reading the book, I think Enemies: A Love Story, a Kindle single, which is excellent oral history, is that the show, sometimes it would take like hours to tape an episode.
Right.
Because, if you're like me, you're watching this and yeah, you can see points where there might be edits, but it totally comes off as live to tape.
Yeah, it does. And I guess they argued so much sometimes, or were perfectionists so much that it would take a long time. I assume, I forget if that came up in that, but, over time that probably got less like that way as they got more comfortable too.
Yeah, I think so, and they became more concise. Like you mentioned, those early episodes, especially the first handful and they got off to a very rough start, and you could tell how unpolished they were.
That first one to me looks like just the way they're talking. I mean, it seems like a PBS or NPR parody sketch.
Yes,
They're very
yes.
low energy. And they're sitting in directors' chairs, and so they sort of have the set idea of a theater, and there's a screen behind them. I mean, the fact that it's behind them too, like they hadn't worked out, oh, we could have two different angles here.
Yes, and it was called, even the title was clunky.
Yes, well,
Opening soon at a theater near you, which Ebert would later mock that title.
but even like the first couple times, like the clip starts playing, like I swear the first time, like Siskel turns around, like he's surprised that it's there.
Right.
And I don't even know if it's really that mystery of that, but
Yeah,
or someone had to, you need to turn around, like you're watching it.
yeah. And it started on a Chicago PBS station and then became syndicated on PBS stations. But maybe it's a really good thing that this concept started from public TV on a local level and was able to grow and have its time. Because even as early as, like we mentioned Star Wars, but that's not too long after that, but in real time, it's not too long after, but in TV time, it's probably an eternity, but they had the opportunity to grow the show on PBS. And then I think the episode we did, by that point, I mean, they were unstoppable, and they were real as big as many movie stars.
Yeah. And again, their chemistry and their ability to be TV people had grown so much, and you see them on clips of Carson or Letterman, and they're perfectly at home on those. And even there's like the bit from SNL where they're reviewing the show as it's happening.
Yeah, that's great.
I mean, it is from, well, is it, I know Eddie Murphy's there, but is it from after Lorne Michaels came back? Because Chevy's hosting.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I think it is.
Their nemesis, Chevy Chase.
Yeah, like 83 or 84 or something.
But that's pretty, I mean, so that's like 8 years after the show started, and they're already big enough that, that the audience is excited to see them.
Yeah, and I think, I've read that each sort of bristled at the idea of being linked together, especially Roger, maybe. Although they each continued with their own, careers and their own lives, but eventually they just kind of embraced it, and they realized, yeah, you know what, we're a team as far as this part of our lives, this show. But they were such a great act, and I think anybody that really wants to realize like the essential appeal of them, really should go seek out like the Letterman appearances, the Tonight Show appearances, because they were in shorter segments, and a lot of their personality came out, especially the more comfortable they got. Like as the 80s went on, you can kind of see that progression. And Mike, I think for me, their review shows, I remember watching them, but it wasn't like a weekly thing. Although as I got older, it would have been. But as I said, I think it was syndication. It was a little bit harder to find. I think the show would be preempted sometimes, maybe moved around. So for me, I think a lot of my knowledge of Siskel and Ebert came from watching them on things like Saturday Night Live and talk shows and hearing other people, talk about them, as opposed to watching the show itself every week.
I would say I had the opposite. And it might be, I think when it was a Tribune show, it was probably, I think one of the channels in Atlanta was a Tribune station, like one of the UHF stations, so it was probably on there. But then I remember during the Buena Vista years, it might have even been on like in the afternoon or something, or in that coveted like 7 o'clock Saturday night time. But I remember watching it a lot. It was just exciting to see clips and things. Like I can specifically remember watching when they reviewed Return of the Jedi. Because it was a chance to see clips from it before it came out.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because like for me at the time, I think I probably watched the show more like in the 90s, and like in the 80s I don't think I was watching it regularly. It was more of an occasional thing, whereas in the 90s, if I knew it was going to be on, I'd make more of an effort, because part of it was I was old enough to go to myself, by myself, to pay and watch movies, so it was a little bit more essential to stay on top of what's coming out and everything. But at the time, I think I might have been more interested in the clips, but now I'm much less interested in the clips, and I don't like necessarily fast forward through them sometimes, but sometimes I kind of want to a little bit, because I'm more interested in the discussion.
Oh yeah, totally. And sometimes like, is this clip going to end?
Yeah.
What? Or like the Batman, when we get into that, I mean, they show like 3 or 4 clips and kind of almost like describe the whole movie.
They really do. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think maybe they thought that was, like you just articulated, it was a big appeal of the show. So, but really, to me, it's like, well, and again, like back then, you didn't have in the 90s, with the rise of like Entertainment Weekly and sort of like the entertainment media covering all this stuff, you would get more saturation coverage. But like in the 80s, well, in the late 70s especially, and into the 80s, you might have like Premiere Magazine, and maybe like People and the newspapers might have an entertainment writer or something like that. But you wouldn't have this massive coverage of the movies, so that by the time a movie came out, you would know so much about it. So back then, it was more of a thrill, as you say, to see actual footage from that movie because you hadn't been, beaten over the head with it for months with teasers and trailers and alternate trailers and multiple talk shows with stars going around and showing clips and everything. So yeah, the clips were much more unique back then too.
Yeah, and that was interesting to read in that book that, at first, of course, the studios didn't want them to have clips. And then they let them, they gave them some sort of print that they could choose them from. And then eventually they kind of realized, oh, this is free publicity. So they started giving them just a package of clips to choose from, which I think made their lives easier in a way.
Sure.
Because they were having to go somewhere and choose the clips and have someone cut them out and all of that.
Which I had no idea that they ever did any of that. I always kind of assumed, especially growing up, that they were just given those clips and then they would tailor what they were talking about to the clip rather than the other way around.
Yeah. But they created they and the people who helped make the show, made this format that, even when you see one critic talking, you see Leonard Maltin on Entertainment Tonight, they still stick him in a little theater with a screen, which is straight from all the Siskel and Ebert shows. He might not be debating anyone, but
right,
except for his stomach.
Yes.
But, same idea. I mean, not that they were the first TV critics, because Gene Shalit at least beat them to that. But
yeah, they were definitely the most influential and, like you say, really defined TV movie criticism for years. I did try to do a little research in this to try to find who was the first regular TV critic. Do you know, and there's a book about film criticism by Jerry Roberts, and he points to Judith Crist. In 1962, I think it was, she started doing local, on WABC in New York, she was doing reviews for a local TV station there. And then I think the next year, 1963, she started as a regular critic on the Today Show. So years before even Gene Shalit. And I think Roberts is the one that calls her, I'm not sure the exact language, but he says something like, she was the first nationally known film critic and sort of the first multimedia celebrity of film criticism, he refers to her. So that's good enough for me. And she went on to, for years, she worked for TV Guide, reviewing movies that would be on TV, like the week ahead. And she was on WOR in New York for a while, kind of in their local news spot as a critic. So I think she might be the first. And then, as you said, Gene Shalit and Joel Siegel were on the morning shows for a while. And Leonard Maltin was actually somebody on Entertainment Tonight, because Entertainment Tonight was on a lot in my household. I may have seen more Leonard Maltin reviews than I did Siskel and Ebert. So there were a lot of other ones, but Gene and Roger were definitely setting the pace for everyone, I think.
Yeah, I was going to guess J. Fred Muggs was the first. So at least the Today Show was right.
Yes, you were close, yes.
Interesting that on morning shows, the requirement, at least for a long time, to be the movie critic was to have a giant mustache.
That's right.
It's an interesting thing because not only does Gene Shalit, of course, look like a Groucho Marx impersonator, but Joel Siegel does a little bit. But Michael Midvet also. And then Bill Harris has a giant mustache, but
he does,
his hair's
yes.
red. So I think I'm probably making this up. I think the little disguise glasses with the mustache and the nose and the glasses, I think when I was a kid, I thought those were based on Gene Shalit.
Oh, I love it.
Before I knew who Groucho was. And I don't know, are they based on Groucho even? I don't know. They must be.
So you'd go to a store, look at the rack of cheap toys and say, hey, look at all those Gene Shalit disguises.
Yeah. Because the Today Show was on a lot in my house when I was young.
Yeah.
And then there would be this guy in a messy, quote-unquote, office.
Though, on a slightly more serious note, though, I think there's probably for a while there was more of a distinction between maybe print criticism and television criticism. And I know Gene Shalit and Joel Siegel were mocked for years. Maybe Joel Siegel for being too kind, and Gene Shalit for his pun reviews. And even Siskel and Ebert, I think, got criticism, for reducing things to thumbs up and thumbs down, which wasn't their intent. And I think if you actually watch their show, they're trying to get it, they explain why they feel the way they feel, and they usually do a very good job of that. But it seemed like especially in the beginning, there was a little bit of resentment of them, and probably a lot of it was professional jealousy about them being so big doing this. But a lot of these TV critics, they're trying to get across their message in very limited windows of time, and even Siskel and Ebert only have like X amount of minutes to devote to any individual movie.
Right. They were, because they were the most popular, sort of the poster boys for that, for dumbing down criticism. And yet, if you listen to them talk about it, in not just the thumbs, then they're really passionate about it. And as they say all the time in things you see, interviews and stuff, that they love movies and they want them all to be good. The other thing that helped me sort of, I mean, I liked it, and then there was probably a period where I was snooty and like, oh, dumbing it down, was, when Ebert's website really became a thing, and I could read his criticism and see how thoughtful he was and what a good writer he was.
Right. Yeah.
And then you're like, well, he knows what he's talking about, and he's not dumbing it down. And they also were not, again, just into art films or something, that they enjoyed a well-made entertainment as much as a French movie or something.
Yeah, and Ebert in particular would always stress that, his job is to evaluate how the movie does what it's supposed to be doing.
Yes.
And it'd probably be impossible for him to always be able to make that distinction, but he was always aware of it, it seemed like, and would mention that, and he thought it was very important. I liked the fact that he had that consistent philosophy, and I'm sure Gene did too.
I think his was a little different from what I saw in some appearances on talk shows. Like he was talking about something. It actually for him, if the movie, he was talking about a Benji movie that Ebert liked.
Yes, Benji the Hunted.
Yes, and his argument was like it wasn't trying to do anything, so therefore it's not nearly as good as Batman, right? Is that what he's comparing?
It was Apocalypse Now, I think.
Is it Apocalypse Now?
I think they reviewed those two on the same show.
It's Full Metal Jacket.
Oh, Full Metal Jacket. I'm sorry. Yes,
that's right. Yeah. And he's right. Ebert gave Full Metal Jacket a thumbs down, and Siskel liked it, but he didn't. And the reverse of the Benji movie. And Siskel's point is, well, Full Metal Jacket's really trying to do something, so that's part of why and it's not that Ebert's saying one is better than the other, just one he can recommend and one he can't, which is a distinction.
Yes, it is. That's a good point, and that I do remember seeing that conversation, and actually that full episode is actually available on YouTube where they talk about both movies. Although I don't remember the discussion being quite that
passionate.
Passionate as they refer to it later. Although who knows what? Maybe that's one of the ones where they went on for 4 hours and they had to edit it down. But
yeah. Because, and then they're on, what, is it Joan Rivers they're talking to about that?
I think I saw them talking about it to Johnny Carson.
Yeah, okay.
But, they might have talked about it, multiple places, because it seems to be, that's a good example because it does kind of point out, the difference between them. Although I do think it's kind of like, I can kind of see both sides of it. I think maybe it's not that different as as maybe they think it is, but because ultimately, I mean, if you have to recommend the movie with qualifications, are you really recommending the movie? Whereas Gene's more saying, well, I just don't think it's a good movie, period. I think, but the fact is they do have nuance, and they are able to get that across, even in, the limited window they have on television.
Yes, and sometimes they argue about very nuanced.
But they love the movies, and it's not just that they like all kinds of movies, but they really are passionate and love movies, and that really comes across. Whereas I think you don't necessarily get that love of cinema and movies, in general, from some of the other people that reviewed movies on television. But you really did with them. And, one thing is we wanted to talk about a regular episode, but there's a lot of the themed episodes. I know you've been watching some of these as well, whether that be the best ofs or, episodes on like a topic. Those are really good. And I think while the regular episodes sort of get the often contentious relationship across better, the themed episodes really have, as far as like intelligent, like an entertaining talk about movies, those themed episodes are really the way to go. Some of those are really good. Like
the best ofs, they're more likely to disagree a little bit there on the best ofs, where the worst ofs are pretty much in sync with what's terrible.
And they see those best ofs as important. Like they're sharing their list, but they don't see it as like arbitrary. They see it as like, okay, if we're going to present this list, we need to defend it, and it's important that we're choosing this. They see it as kind of a big job to say what the best movies are.
Yeah, like I saw one, they got into a exchange about Children of the Lesser God. Gene liked it and Roger didn't think it did enough to address the subject of deafness or to film it in a way that addressed it. And then I watched one, I think today, where they're bemoaning colorization. They're very passionate about it and have a lot of good reasons why it's not a good idea, and why at the time, of course, the technology was pretty terrible too. And they show some examples.
Some of the favorite episodes I've watched recently, actually this might have been a while ago when I first started watching these, was they did a couple of episodes called, I think they called it They'll Do It Every Time, about movie cliches.
Or did people mail in the suggestions? Sorry.
Yes. Yes, it was a review of the proposed Stanley Kubrick adaptation of They'll Do It Every Time, the comic strip. The panel. But those are, I think they did two of those, I think, that I've seen, and they're joking about like fruit stands with examples like how anytime you see a fruit stand in a movie, it's going to get plowed into by a car, And the way they do it, they're dissecting these, and they just do it in such an entertaining way that, of course, they're laughing about how trite these cliches are, but it really comes from a place of like they really appreciate the good stuff, and it's nice to see them both like having such a good time making fun of this stuff too. So those are episodes I'd really recommend as well.
I will seek those out. And it does, again, you mentioned like, they're 20 something minutes, so you can plow through them pretty quickly.
Yeah. That's, and it's interesting because like, it's so cool that there's so much of them, but there's so little of some of the other critics. I guess maybe partly because of like the format. So it's tough. It was tough to find like Gene Shalit clips because, there's not a whole lot of complete Today shows running or people just aren't putting those up. Leonard Maltin, it was surprisingly tough to find, Maltin clips and everything. You really had to have to kind of dig for some of that stuff. So I really find it, I really feel fortunate that there's so many different uploaders, primarily on YouTube, I'll just say, that have preserved this stuff and put it up there from all years of the show, really. So it's very cool.
Right, and those early ones, that was, as they mentioned in the book, that those come from the era of tape erasing, so that's like an actual service to have those up there.
Yeah, and there's some years, I think maybe like the late 70s, maybe it's easier to find like clips of particular movies, which is another way you can watch the show by going through and saying, okay, what did they say about Batman? And you can find usually somebody's put that clip. It seems to me like the 90s and the 80s, especially once you get to when they moved to Disney, like in 86, it seems like those are pretty easy to find, those full episodes. And the earlier, except for that first handful, maybe some of those are a little bit harder to find. But I had pretty good luck, finding looking for specific movies and kind of finding those episodes. So.
All right, well, let's start talking about this episode, which, as we said, is from 1989, the summer of 1989.
According to the information I found, this would have premiered June 24th, 1989, so that would be a Saturday, which makes sense. And there's the opening weekend of Batman.
Right. And my memory is 1989, that summer was a pretty big summer for movies. Just Batman. Just looking at the list of this episode, Batman, Hunting a Chunk of Kids, Ghostbusters 2, and a small movie called Kung Fu Master. But, I mean, just Batman and Ghostbusters 2. That's a pretty big week.
Two highly anticipated movies.
Yes. Yeah. And the third Indiana Jones movie was out that summer, too.
That's right, yeah. And this, I think this was a time when I was really getting into, like, reading Premiere Magazine and really starting to get into, like, okay, watching more movies and the whole culture of it, so.
Right. This was the summer I started driving, so.
Ooh.
It was definitely a big movie summer.
Yeah.
Because I could drive to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course Batman had been in Comic Scene magazine, was being hyped for like at least a year.
Oh, I loved Comic Scene magazine.
Yes.
What a great publication that was. I mean, I really did. That was so cool.
Yeah. You go to the mall every 4 months. 2 months, whenever it came out, and find a new issue. It was great.
Yeah, at a time when superhero movies were a novelty.
Yeah, and they were covering them all. Batman, the theatrical Captain America.
Yeah.
The Ninja Turtles, all that stuff.
It seemed like there were as many in development or being talked about as there were,
Yes.
as anything, And so a lot of it, maybe they just be teases of stuff, but it was cool to read about. And in television, was the same. I think The Flash would come like shortly after this, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And you had the Superboy syndicated show, but not a lot going on, but Comic Scene covered it a lot. But man, this Batman, yes, you're absolutely right. This was a big hype train going for a long time leading up to this.
So I don't know. Do you want to alternate talking about what they say about each movie, the way they would?
That might be difficult to pair up each one with what they said. Well, we could we could try it. We could give it a go on this one. I think it would be easy. It's like to just the essence of what they thought about it.
Like you would say, you would do the lead on this one, and then we'll talk about it. and then I would do the lead on the next one. Like summarize some thoughts, and then we can talk about it. Does that make sense? Like Gene, did the review of Batman,
I see.
and then they both talked about it.
Alrighty.
Okay, so I'll let you start.
All right, well, I'll give it a shot. So the first movie they talk about is Batman, which we've kind of mentioned, what a big deal it was. And like you said earlier, Mike, they show extensive clips from the movie. And this was like a big deal. It was a Tim Burton blockbuster with Michael Keaton as Batman. And one of the things I think that's interesting is they don't really get into... I think they talk about Bruce Wayne and the character, but remember at the time, like the choice of Michael Keaton to play Batman was a really big deal and it kind of divided, I think, the comic book community that I remember. And so it was kind of a controversial choice, and they kind of really just seemed to accept it without getting into a whole lot of depth about, Michael Keaton as Batman, which I thought was interesting. And also there's hardly any talk about the 1960s TV show, which was kind of looming over this movie when it came out. And that's something that, to put it in context, a lot of people were wondering, is, Tim Burton is kind of, has a certain sensibility. The 60s TV show had a certain sensibility. Is this going to be like cartoony? Is this going to be a serious movie? And Siskel and Ebert talk about how it was actually what they call like an adult movie with adult themes. I think Gene actually says it's an adult approach with, adult stars, troubled characters, and a dark look. And he says that it's a risk actually that they did it that way, which interesting. And he says it seems weird to say that that's a risk, but for a superhero movie, I guess it was. And I thought that was interesting. So Gene really liked the movie a lot more. He talks, praises the adult approach and everything, and likes the portrayal of Bruce Wayne in it. But Roger was less positive about it. He ultimately would give it a thumbs down later, but he said, well, he liked the art direction. He said Gotham City is great. He liked the special effects. He compares like the overall visuals to like movies like Metropolis and, Blade Runner as far as creating a distinct setting with Gotham City. But he said he just didn't care about the core characters so much. He said that the Joker went on too long, and they went into this thing where he made a big thing about how, as his example of how he didn't like the characters so much, about Vicky Vale's lack of surprise in terms of seeing, the Bruce Wayne as Batman, which is kind of odd how Roger made a big thing about that. They had a back and forth about that. And, Roger just says there's like kind of hostility in it. He says there's just like a bad feeling about this. And then, Gene asks him kind of like, well, aren't you glad to have that feeling or whatever? So it's interesting that this is such a big movie that they disagreed so much on it. And I really enjoyed the conversation, though. It seemed to do justice to the movie. I could have listened to them talk about it quite longer and not give away so much of the movie in the clips, but I really enjoyed the conversation, Mike.
I did too. I thought it kind of got to a lot of, I guess, a lot of my mixed feelings about that movie too. Like at the time, I would have been right on with Gene, and now I probably agree with some of what Roger was saying more.
That's interesting.
I don't know about the Vicky that thing. That seemed like a very confusing conversation. Because Gene seemed to think, well, everybody knew who everybody was.
Yes.
Which I'm not sure. I mean, I think, I don't remember ever getting the feeling that she knew. But maybe, yeah, it's been a while since I've seen it. So, on Letterman, by the way, they did talk about Keaton a little more. They rehashed their discussion, but because Letterman was, not surprising too much, but that he thought, Michael Keaton was really good in it and better than Jack Nicholson, really. But it's a good conversation. I think it brings up a lot of things. I mean, they're both like, it's not for kids, which is interesting, which I guess I could see. But obviously kids saw it because it was a huge hit. So.
That was part of the coverage at the time, a lot of the biff, pow, bam, and
of course,
like the coverage of the movie treated it like it was a kid's movie in some ways.
Yes. Or said, biff, Batman's not for kids anymore. But yeah, it's cool to see them, again, taking it seriously. I mean, and it also does get into the difficulty of having to give it thumbs up or thumbs down. Like, it's not like Roger hates it. He just can't recommend it.
Yes, and they revisit this at the end of the show in memorable fashion, too.
Yeah.
I remember liking them. I was really excited about the movie at the time. My uncle and aunt owned a business and got, I think they were part of like the promotion for the premiere of it in our area. It was playing at the largest like single theater in town, and we got tickets to like a premiere screening of it, and I just remember like the spectacle of it just being so cool, and the line was so, we had tickets but we had to wait to get in, but there was a big line just to get your seats and everything like that, and just thinking, what, they really pulled this off at the time, and I haven't seen it in many years, this 1989 Batman, but I'm kind of anxious to after watching this. I think I will see it again when I get a chance.
Yeah, I mean, I watched it in the last 5 years or so.
Hmm.
I like a lot of it, but I really like Michael Keaton in it. Still, I think there's just some stuff that it doesn't quite, it doesn't totally work.
I think the clips that they run in this really make me interested, but they don't show some of the stuff I didn't like. Like a lot of some of the Jack Nicholson Joker performance I enjoy, and I think the clips show off some of the best of that. But some of the Jack Nicholson in the movie just like took me out of it. Even then I think so. But it was a huge movie, and I'm sure that a lot of people were very anxious to hear what Siskel and Ebert thought about the movie this weekend.
Yeah, and I'm sure they were anxious to hear what they thought about Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Oh, of course.
So Roger does the main review on it, and he has some good things to say about it, that he feels like the effects look good, and he highlights some scenes like when Rick Moranis almost eats his son, who's in his cereal. But overall, he feels like the storytelling is not up to the effects. Gene doesn't even think it looks good. It reminds him of old live-action Disney. That's not a good thing. And he really is concerned that the kids seem like they're stupid. That like they have no plan. They're just kind of, or Roger says that they're kind of just stumbling into their adventures. So I think he's almost saying like they don't have agency in the story. And Gene has this interesting example he gives where they're running from the lawnmower, and they just keep running in the long grass rather than moving into the short grass where the lawnmower won't go again. And he feels like kids would figure that out. So it's a big 2 thumbs down on that movie. What did you think of their discussion of the movie?
I really like their discussion. I like this is an example of them. They're being negative, but they're saying why, and they both gave very cogent points. I particularly liked Gene's comment. He said it reminded of, like you said, of white bread Disney live action. I wrote that down, which he found boring. I was like thinking like, ouch. But in the way he said that kind of reminds me too of something like that I found about the two of them, where Roger always seems like the more polished speaker, and Gene often isn't necessarily as polished, but he often has a way of delivering his words that make it seem like he's more consciously grasping for the right words as he's saying them. And it doesn't come off as inarticulate or anything, don't get me wrong, but it does. It's a different style, whereas Roger seems to like have everything fully formed in his head as he's saying it. Gene seems to more be like, because he'll sort of look away while he's saying it and things like that. And that was an example of that, I think, where he says it kind of reminds him of the white bread Disney live action. But I thought their comments about the movie were spot on. I don't remember seeing Honey, I Shrunk the Kids straight through. I think it was one of those things I saw in pieces over the years, and haven't seen that in a very long time. But yeah, they were pretty harsh on this, but I think they were fair in their assessments from what they're saying. Although, like you said, Roger did praise the special effects and talked about how they've come a long way since the Incredible Shrinking Man. But I like that discussion, and afterwards they have another good discussion.
Yes, about Tummy Trouble, which is a Roger Rabbit short that opened or played before Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. And I mean, Roger's like, well, it's kind of a rehash of the short that's in the Roger Rabbit movie, but they both overall enjoy it, and then they get into a general discussion about cartoons and how all sorts of things. Within a very short period of time, they address the fact that you don't get cartoons in front of movies anymore, and Roger blames that on the greed of movie studios because there's no way they're going to give you anything for free. They talk about how there's discussion of doing some Tom and Jerry shorts where Tom and Jerry talk and how that's wrong, which I certainly agree with that. They're both just very positive about it, and Gene mentioned some elements of it that he liked in particular. I don't quite remember. I don't think I've ever seen this. I don't know if you can.
I mean, Roger kind of said, well, he started out, I thought he was going to like pan it when he said like a rehash, but then he said it's good, but it's not worth going to the movie by itself. And then Gene kind of pointed out, well, I would say it's not worth it just because it's a 7-minute, short is the only reason, but he seemed really positive on it. So it was a nice little discussion, and Roger's kind of like mini rant about, why you don't get cartoons anymore is very like on point, and one of the most bitter things I've seen him say in a while, actually. He really kind of got into it there and sort of implies that, they could just go into their whole library, like these studios, and put old shorts and they wouldn't even have to make new ones, and that would be at least something, a nice little bonus before movies again. And I kind of like that. I thought that was cool.
Yeah. Before we go on, can we talk a little bit about their physicality? Since you're already talking about how Gene talks.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, Gene usually leans forward when he's talking, which is pretty cool. And then Roger, I get a little, I don't know if obsessed is the right word, but his various hand gestures and the way he moves in his seat, like he kind of wiggles in his seat sometimes when he says something.
Mm-hmm.
I found really fascinating, maybe distracting a little bit. But,
Ah.
and the main hand gesture that I find a little strange is when he holds his hands kind of above his shoulders.
Yes.
Because I don't think I've ever seen anyone else do that.
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about, and he does that a lot.
Yes. And because, you know, in that book, they talk about how the producers had to sort of teach them to, at least teach him to use his hands more when he talked. So it's almost it's a learned thing in a way. So I don't know where that gesture came from. And the wiggle is very interesting too.
Yeah.
To emphasize something and wiggle in his seat. But it works. It's part of their chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
Like it does make, you know, Gene, like because he's leaning forward towards him, but he's also leaning towards the camera.
Right.
He's leaning in to talk to you. It makes him seem intense, which he was.
Yeah, it certainly is, and they're both distinct. You know, like besides the obvious subject of jokes of their physical features, like you said, the physicality of how they talked was distinct enough too, and like you say, it works together. They're not copies of each other in any way, and even though they're two distinct guys talking about movies, and that's another element that really makes the show work.
Yeah. All right.
So next we come to Ghostbusters 2, which was a very anticipated sequel. I mean, at the time, I don't remember being like cynical in the sense of like, oh boy, why would they even make a Ghostbusters 2? No, remember thinking, hey, cool, they're going to make another Ghostbusters movie. You know, I was at the age where I loved the first Ghostbusters and was looking forward to the second one. And I don't remember exactly what Gene and Roger said about the first one, but they are very unambiguous in their dislike of the second one. Gene starts off talking about how there's just very little comic energy or invention, and he doesn't directly use this phrase, but he seems to say that he thinks that everybody was phoning it in. I think especially the writers and even the cast a little bit, and just everybody involved in the production just didn't put much effort into it. He says it's virtually a carbon copy, just with too many like tired and familiar elements, and he kind of runs down some specific things that they're talking about the clip, and they have an example of a scene between some more secondary characters, Rick Moranis and Annie Potts, that sort of works a little bit because it involves something that you can kind of identify with a little bit. But he says it's kind of like filming it's almost like they were filming the first draft of a script, which is a very concise way of putting it. And Roger really says he agrees with them, and he says he just did not get into the movie. And he points out, which is kind of interesting here, that they don't always do this, but he said, I think he kind of refers to a lot of people think that they're just critics, watching this in like sterile environments, but he says he actually saw it in a theater in Michigan and before with a full house, and he said there was one laugh in 2 hours, and he just calls it a complete disappointment. And both of them were very surprised at just what they perceive as the lack of effort into this movie. And I really enjoyed this conversation as well, but I don't think Roger said what the one laugh was. And if he did, you can refresh my mind, Mike, but I'd love to know what that one laugh was.
No, he didn't. They talked about some other laugh that was in it, though.
Yeah, there was another, like, some reference, like film buff reference.
Yes.
I think Gene mentions that he thought was funny.
Yeah, but but most people aren't going to know that. Or most Ghostbusters fans aren't going to know.
Yeah. I think, now that you mention it, I think, as I recall, I think Roger kind of said it one way, and I think he kind of
The striking thing, besides them both using the word disappointment multiple times with different adjectives, Gene said, he's like, you have a home run going in. How cynical to not even try. So they were kind of angry about it, I think. I did see the episode where they reviewed Ghostbusters, and I'm trying to remember. I think they both liked a lot of it. And I know Gene specifically praised Bill Murray, and Roger praised Harold Ramis. And they laughed at some things, but I can't remember if they both gave it a thumbs up or not. But they were more positive than this, for sure.
That kind of reminds me of something else that's kind of interesting about going back and watching these is, like, the Batman segment here is a pretty memorable thing, and it was the one that led off the show, and they gave a lot of time to the movie. But some of the movies that turned out to be huge, like Ghostbusters, and I don't know about that one, but they didn't necessarily spend a lot of time or as much time as you would think of now. It was a movie that came out, and maybe it didn't, they couldn't know that it would be like the phenomenon it would be. And so like Ghostbusters was something else. You go back now and, a lot of them, they treated them as like the big movie of the weekend, but some of them, they didn't necessarily treat them that way or give them as much screen time because they weren't as big until they became popular with audiences.
Yeah. or, I think neither of them like Beverly Hills Cop.
I'm going to have to watch that one.
I haven't seen that. I've seen him mention it elsewhere, but Roger definitely didn't like it. So the last movie is a French movie called Kung Fu Master, which is a love story about a 14-year-old boy and a 40-year-old woman from the director of another movie I liked called The Vagabond. And Kung Fu Master comes from this video game that the kid plays, and it's directed by a woman and written by the actress who plays the 40-year-old woman, based on some experience she had as a teenager, and the director's son plays the boy, and they're both very fond of this. I mean, they talk a lot about how it has to walk a line, because, of course, it could look like something very untoward. And I don't get the sense it's really a physical relationship, but they have this brief sort of emotional affair, I guess. That's not just about, replacing like a maternal figure or something. And Gene liked how it talked about how people fall in love, so that it's not just a typical sort of Hollywood love story where the people belong together, get together. So it's interesting. I certainly had never heard of this movie, and I can see why maybe it wouldn't go over well in the U.S., not just being French, but being subtle about something that is a delicate subject. And it's interesting to see it with these three other kind of blockbuster movies.
It is. I saw Kung Fu Master and I thought one thing, and then found out it's, an Agnes Varda film, and I had never heard of this either. And it's an interesting conversation, but this is probably the least successful of their 4 segments, because, and I think Roger even refers to this, he can't really describe what makes the movie. He says there's a delicate line between the pure and the profane. And I think he even says something like he can't even really explain on television why it falls on one side. It just seems like it's the kind of thing like it's difficult to articulate in this forum. And I'll give them the benefit of the doubt on that. I mean, I know when I was watching it, like right away, the premise of it sounded like ridiculous. And it's like, oh, no way, this is totally inappropriate. But I haven't seen the movie. And they seem to try to get it, Gene says it's the subject is love, not old, young relationships. It's like, well, yeah, but still, and it's kind of interesting, I think, how you still have movies that sort of get at these inappropriate relationships, and they're more careful about it now, but there are still some movies like this. Well, I don't know like this, but broaching that subject, I should say. Art movies, I mean, this is not like a big movie or anything. This is, like you said, a small French independent film. But in some ways, it shows how while we all think that maybe Hollywood is much more permissive, and in most ways it is nowadays, but at the same time, just the thought of this movie right now, it kind of makes you turn up your nose and just kind of repels me right away. It's like, well, boy, hey, what were they even thinking? You kind of have to think, well, it was different, and maybe it was handled in a different way. But the subject matter really kind of turns me off just even before they get into talking about the movie, and they can't even really articulate it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I do like seeing them talk about a more delicate movie, I guess, because they are, they can be kind of brash. So you see the sensitivity under their brashness.
That's true.
But it is, they're struggling.
And they make great effort to establish that they're not endorsing, that or anything, or
right, yeah.
They definitely aren't.
And I think, doesn't Roger say something like even the movie's not taking a position, it's just showing it.
Right. Which, depending on how it's done, that would be bad in itself. I mean, he's to me, it just seems like this is the kind of movie that's very difficult to really understand unless you actually see it. But, also their segment didn't really do anything to make me want to see it either. But it's also nice to have, for the reasons you described, and others, it's nice to have a smaller movie on the show with these 3 like blockbusters that were coming out at the same time.
Yeah, and then we have this that you alluded to already, their little argument at the end. So I'll let you describe that if you want.
Oh, well, I really can't. I don't think I can do it justice, but they do their summaries, and this is a staple of every episode where they go through and Batman, Gene gave it a thumbs up and Roger gave it a thumbs down. And what I like about when they do that segment is I think they're usually pretty gracious to the other person, and they don't use that summary to say Gene was a total idiot, and but they'll kind of articulate in brief terms why the other person felt the way they did, even if they disagreed. And I think it's a pretty good way they do that. And this episode is no exception. However, at the end, Gene can't let it go, and he kind of says, like, he starts, and he's leaning in towards Roger this time, and he's saying, I think you had a good time, and he starts to kind of tell him, I think you you like. I forget exactly how he says it, but he starts telling Roger kind of what he thought, and then Roger says, "Well, Gene, if you're so good at telling me, what I thought or why, I liked it, what's the point of me even being here? You can just tell everybody what I think." And it's one of the really kind of like snippy moments of that episode, and there's just a flash of it there. But I mean, Roger has a legitimate point there.
He does, but it's also like two kids talking.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't want me here, I just won't, I'll take my ball and go home.
Yeah.
Roger says, if you're so good at telling me I had a better time and how I felt and what I thought, I don't know why it's necessary for me to be on the show. And then Gene says, I thought about that too.
Yeah. That it's hard to hear Gene's retort because Roger's still talking when he says that, and Gene kind of puts it in there, and I think he's smiling when he says that, but I mean that was a classic exchange. That's kind of what people think of when they hear Siskel and Ebert. But I think what Roger really was responding to was Gene presuming to tell him what he felt about the movie, and that's something that Roger does not like people doing.
Right, and that's an interesting thing that I think comes up in that book, and in some of those talk show appearances, is that he feels like how someone responds to a movie is very personal, and so it's not just the intellectual part, but it's whatever, how it makes you feel and think. And so yeah, the idea of someone telling him what he felt, that would be offensive, especially that bald guy across the aisle from him.
Yes, and for Gene's part, I mean the two of them were very competitive with each other. I mean, they were, for years, yes. They were on rival newspapers, in the same market and fighting each other for profiles. And they talked about this in the book and on talk shows, and getting access. And they do all kinds of like things and stuff. But it also seemed like they wanted to be right, And this seemed like a real case of Gene in particular wanting to be right and kind of trying to manipulate Roger into conceding something, that he wouldn't concede. That it's a great moment. One thing you notice when you go back and watch these, a lot of times they really agree on a lot of stuff, and they don't argue as much as you think. It's on those other appearances, like in the talk shows, where they kind of like do the back and forth and the bickering. And kind of going back and watching some of these too, Mike, I noticed that like they'll say like something, any mild disagreement, the audience starts like tittering a little bit, like they expect the bickering, they don't even have to do it, and the audience is already ahead of them on that. But this is like a great example of them like momentarily getting a little touchy with each other.
Yeah. So, yeah, like one of the Carson appearances I watched, maybe the one we were talking about, right, the Full Metal Jacket discussion, at some point they're so into it that he's just, like, Johnny does a take to the camera.
Yes.
Like, why am I here?
Right.
But then, like, their appearances with Letterman are different because it's almost, like, so I this morning I watched, like, Roger's first appearance after Gene died, which they quote some of in the book. But, Dave is like, I kind of think of myself as the third Siskel and Ebert. like the fifth Beatle, like that they were pals, sort of. And I saw a little bit of a clip. It was hard to watch. So when Gene was sick, but they were on there, and him talking about it, Dave had actually called him, and they talked for like half an hour about baseball or something. And he really appreciated that.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a sense of them being contemporaries, and of course they're all Midwesterners, and I really like the energy of all that, even though Dave also, on these collections I was watching, there were a whole lot of Roger fat jokes, like when he wasn't on the show.
Yeah.
But then there's one at the end where he does one, and then he says, "This is the last one we're ever going to do," and they bring Roger out, and he gives him the cue card and stuff. It's nice. You did get a sense of like actual affection, and that was definitely moved and by Gene dying. And like he said, the thing they talk about in the book is he's like tells Roger, "Well, you should just do your own show. You shouldn't do this show anymore because I just want to see my friend Gene there, and he's not there."
Yeah.
But Ebert has a good argument for that. About this episode, I also want to mention the sponsors at the end. Because it's interesting that, it's almost like a game show. Here are just some random sponsors. So, Raisinets and Goobers, Palmolive, Tappan Microwaves, which I've never heard of.
Yeah.
And Scotty Brothers presenting Eddie and the Cruisers 2. The rock movie of the summer or something like that. I'm like, I bet they didn't like that movie.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm curious as to how they treated that.
And I didn't realize Scotty Brothers produced. I didn't realize Scotty Brothers made any movies.
No. I will say it did seem like there's the potential for conflicts, but I watched an episode where they were, I think, and they were under the Disney umbrella at the time, and they were very critical of a Disney release of a movie.
Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
But like Peter Pan. and Ebert like points out, they're mentioning Disney by name and how they, had altered the picture to make it look, and how it should be seen as it was intended to be seen and everything. And it was just kind of an interesting thing that shows, hey, they weren't afraid to criticize Disney when they felt it was warranted, beyond just, trashing some of the new movies. But yeah, that's an interesting set of sponsors.
Candy that nobody likes.
Yeah.
Some dish soap, microwave, Eddie and the Cruisers too. Yeah, like I said, I just loved watching all of these.
Yeah, and this was like kind of a dream episode of mine. So I thank you for agreeing to do this, because I've kind of wanted to do this for quite a while, but I hadn't been watching the episodes until we decided to do this. So it's a lot of fun. It's really easy to watch a bunch of these, as you said. It's a very worthwhile experience on many levels. It's an effective TV show, and it's cool to kind of go back and enjoy movie history like this.
Yeah. So let's talk briefly about some of the others, like their replacements. I mean, I think we've mentioned them a little bit. So on PBS, Jeffrey Lyons and Michael Medved took over sneak previews. And I think they did that well into the 90s, right?
Yeah, they continued the show more, like longer than I had thought, too. But yeah, I think they went on a good 5 or 6 years at least.
And like you said, they're just, it's not quite as engaging. Of course, Michael Medved has a little bit of a reputation for kind of being a moralist or something. He does,
which is funny, because he had written like Golden Turkey books, I think, right? Where he trashed bad movies, and where his offense would be to people that like the movies, maybe being a little bit, too harsh on some like beloved like B movies or something like that. And then, he sort of developed a second career as like an opinionist, and, kind of, taking a certain like moralistic view on things, and being very critical of things. Like, I remember when I found that out, or when I was aware that he was doing, I was very surprised, because I just remembered him as this mild-mannered movie critic on TV.
Yeah, it does. It seems weird, and like it unfortunately influenced when I was watching. Like, oh, he's not going to like this movie, but he liked Platoon. So, and I have to say, all that aside, I mean, he doesn't have the charm of Siskel or Ebert or anything, but he's an okay TV personality. I think maybe just because everything he says, he sounds cheerful, which Joel Siegel kind of has that too. They're just good at smiling while they talk.
Right.
And Jeffrey Lyons' son was one of the Bens, right?
Yes, Ben Lyons.
Yes, with Ben Mankiewicz.
Yeah, B-Mank.
Yeah.
That was years later, yes, after.
Yes, when Ebert couldn't really do it anymore. But yeah, so it just, but otherwise it's pretty much the same show. Other than they give it a yes or a no, I think, rather than a thumbs up.
Right.
Because, of course, we know Roger Ebert at some point trademarked that. But
I think even after, 4 or 5 years, they just didn't have the chemistry. I mean, it did seem more like two guys that were put together for the show, qualified, but having really no connection, whereas Gene and Roger were actually like bitter enemies. But yet when you watch them on the show, especially like in the 80s, you would think that they were guys who had grown up there and had known each other their whole lives.
Yeah. And again, these guys seem a little bit eggheady.
Yeah.
And then on At the Movies, which was the Tribune title, Rex Reed and Bill Harris take over. And Bill Harris might be relatable, but I don't know that Rex Reed comes off as relatable.
Rex Reed does not have that Midwestern everyman sensibility that you could argue Siskel and Ebert had.
Although I learned he grew up in Oklahoma.
Yes, which is fascinating.
Yes.
And you want to talk about somebody that's cheerful all the time. I think Bill Harris, man, everything he says is kind of cheerful. Even through the mustache, you can kind of see the smile on his face.
Yeah, even if he doesn't like something. Although it's hard to tell because the clips were incomplete. Well, he there was one about Full Metal Jacket, which Rex Reed loved, so that was interesting to see him like anything. And Bill Harris only liked like half of it. He liked the first half, I think, which is, I think, a common reaction to that movie.
Yes. I think Rex Reed is a good example of what I was talking about earlier, where it seems like Rex Reed is composing. It often seems like he's reading his print review, and it just doesn't come off as spontaneous. It seems like he's trying to get in zingers and be funny. Whereas Siskel and Ebert, it seems like it's the passion for the movies really comes through more, and it just seems more spontaneous, whether it is or not. It just feels differently than especially when a lot of these guys we're mentioning, but Rex Reed in particular. But he had been a critic for years.
Right, and a sort of a pundit of sorts on TV, I think.
And is still around today, yeah.
Yeah, and then we already mentioned Gene Shalit a little bit, who predates them, and he's his own thing with his little 2-minute blasting through a movie and making jokes and stuff. And then your boy Leonard Maltin.
Yeah.
Talk about cheerful.
Yeah.
He's a very good TV personality.
He is. He has a unique approach in the sense that, like, I like it kind of when he's negative about it. He just seems disappointed, you know?
Yeah.
Like, oh, man, you know, and...
Now, there's that Dune one. He really disliked that.
Yeah.
And was as snarky as he could get, I think.
I think I saw one a while ago of him reviewing Aliens, and I think he had a similar reaction, you know, like...
I did see that he liked Aliens, but that was the one where he talked about having a weak stomach.
Yes, but he was, like, genuinely afraid of
Yes.
the movie.
Yeah, and I think one of them was like a complete Entertainment Tonight, right, that you sent me.
Yes.
And I think there was a Dune one, but Bill Harris was on there giving gossip.
Yeah, Bill Harris was all over the place in the 1980s especially.
And I actually watched the whole episode just because I was like,
oh, cool.
I want to see what this was like again. It's interesting because they like sent Dixie Watley to Australia to talk to Matt Dillon for a 2-minute segment. And maybe it was a Paramount movie or something, and she was really doing the press kit or something. You know, I don't know what.
Hopefully at least she did a detour and talked to Paul Hogan or something for another story.
I hope so.
You know, and that's another connection because Rex Reed and Dixie Watley were paired at the last days of At the Movies. She replaced Bill Harris.
Which I guess I remember that. I don't know. Because I thought I didn't remember Bill Harris. And then, yeah, as soon as I saw him, like, oh, yeah, that guy.
You know, Shallot, did you watch Gene Shallot's review of The Shining? He really did not like that at all.
No. Stanley Kubrick responsible for the dulling of The Shining.
Yes.
Yeah, he thought it was all shock.
Yeah.
He did praise Scatman Crothers. So.
Yeah, well, he's all right by me then.
And hey, he's still with us right now.
Ah, Gene Shalit. Yeah, he's in his, 90s now?
Yeah, I think he's like 96 or something.
Wow.
I kind of want to see him.
Yeah.
If he still looks basically the same.
I don't know. Probably doesn't match that classic Gene Shalit disguise that
right.
toy and novelty manufacturers have sold billions of over the years.
But like you said, none of these guys quite live up. And even I never had a big problem with Richard Roper, but he was no Gene.
No, it was tough for anybody, and they tried. I mean, the show went on, and for a while they made a deliberate effort to, you know, when Gene left, and I think when Roger left, they tried to avoid having somebody come in and be the guy that replaced the guy. But ultimately, you just couldn't capture it again. And I'm not saying it wasn't worth trying. I like this kind of show. I haven't seen anything with this kind of format in years, but I still like the format. If you get two people that can do it, it could still work. Yeah. And Gene and Rogers have left such a big shadow, too, that anything would be compared to that right away unless you change the format pretty radically, I think. Actually, I want to give a shout out to The Ringer did a podcast, I think, called Gene and Roger last year that I think kind of got me thinking about doing an episode, too. And it's a very good podcast. They well researched and well presented. So I'd recommend that as well as the Kindle single oral history that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and then just digging into YouTube.
Yeah, and Roger Ebert's website, I think, still has like a ton of his original reviews, written reviews online, right?
I think so. And I think they have like critics that work for them, right? That still review movies. I haven't been there in a long time. But.
And Roger had many collections of his books and things. I don't know how easy it is to find Gene Siskel's writing unless, you know, you have like can go through the old newspapers, because I don't think that was collected as much. But it's important to remind ourselves, too, that they continued working as newspaper critics and writers during most of the run of the show.
But if you have some sort of trunk subscription,
yes,
you can access them all.
I have a feeling like David Letterman would have liked saying trunk.
Yes, I think so. I enjoy saying it.
Yes, I like hearing it.
All right. Well, if you want to lean in or use weird hand gestures while you discuss this podcast or other episodes of it, join us on our Facebook group. Let us know. Are you more of a Gene or more of a Roger? And, you know, one other thing, Mike, and maybe I can ask you this. I guess maybe we might kind of touched on this, but were you influenced by their reviews or any reviews? Like, would they change your mind about whether to see a movie or not? I don't know if they would. Yeah, maybe sometimes. I think maybe, yeah, probably. Probably not like a big movie, like Batman. I would have seen Batman anyway. Right. But, I bet there are movies I saw because they liked them. Yeah. Especially in that like you were talking about in the 90s, or maybe even after, when it was Ebert and Roper. I was reading his reviews a lot. They're probably like smaller movies that I saw because they praised them. Maybe like 1 Hour Photo or something would be the kind of movie.
I think probably the same with me. And if they gave something, especially in that era, if they were both negative on something, I might just like, well, maybe I'll wait for it on video or something, but I'm not going to bother seeing it right now. But I should also mention though that I was, like I said, I was reading Entertainment Weekly and looking at like, out of town newspapers. Maybe was in college and really loved. Like the Friday newspaper was my favorite, the weekend sections, because they would have all the movie reviews. So I was taking in so much more than just, seeing what Siskel and Ebert were saying. And so really it was kind of like the whole critical mass I was taking in rather than just those two. So
I can tell you this review of Ghostbusters 2 did not dissuade me from making my dad go to see Ghostbusters 2 with me.
And did your dad give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down?
I think he probably gave it
Yeah.
it would be a thumbs down.
Yeah.
I think. I probably liked it at the time, but I don't even really care for the original that much anymore. So I'm sure I wouldn't like the second one.
Yeah.
At the time, I was in high school. It was exciting.
Right.
Like you said, oh, hey, another Ghostbusters.
Yeah. I do remember being disappointed going out of it, but I don't think to the extent that Gene and Roger were disappointed by it.
No.
Like, just questioning the entire effort of the production. I don't remember doing that.
Yeah. You don't remember saying, boy, that was a cynical movie.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I give this episode a thumbs up.
I give it a thumbs up as well.
Are we allowed to do that?
I'm agree. For once, Mike, I agree with you on this.
Yeah. All right. And until next time, the living room is closed. I don't know.
Works for me.
That's still better than, who is it, Lions and Medved who say, save the aisle seats for us?
Yeah. This episode brought to you by Raisinets and Goobers. Please buy some. Our warehouses are bursting at the seams. This episode also brought to you by Hot Buttered Popcorn. Hot Buttered Popcorn. This episode also brought to you by Healthy Debate. Healthy Debate. Join us next time for another exciting episode of Battle of the Network Shows. Learn more, leave feedback, and suggest future episodes at battleofthenetworkshows.com. Follow us on Twitter at BatNetShows and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Battle of the Network Shows.